A cowboy lay dying of snakebite. A runaway slave girl saved him and found him. The rattler was already gone when I opened my eyes. Didn't even hear it coming, which is the thing that still bothers me even now. 12 years on the open range, and I let a timber rattler catch me in the left calf while I was crouching to check the shoe on my horse. 6 years old, that horse. Best animal I ever had. Name was Dobie, short for nothing, just Dobie. He'd shied back, and that's what saved my life, because he knocked me sideways and the bite landed high on the calf instead of the ankle. And a few inches of meat and muscle is the kind of difference that separates a man from a mound of dirt in open country. I remember pulling my boot off. The skin around the 2 punctures had already gone tight and hot, reddening fast like I'd pressed a coal against it. I remember the smell of the grass, dry and sharp in the July heat. I remember thinking, clear as anything, that I'd better get to the creek and that I'd better do it fast. And then I remember my legs not working right and Dobie blowing hard through his nose above me like he was trying to talk some sense into me. That was the last clear thing for a while. The creek was maybe 400 yards from where I went down. I know because I paced it later when I could walk again. I don't know how I got there. My knees were torn up and my hands were scraped raw, so I figure I crawled the last part. The poison had hold of me by then. The leg had swollen and my heart was hammering wrong, too fast and too loud in my own ears. I'd cut the wound with my belt knife and tried to work some of the bad blood out, which is what every man I'd ever ridden with said you were supposed to do, and maybe it helped some, or maybe it didn't matter. I lay on my side in the shallows with the water up to my hip and my face pressed against the mud of the bank, and I didn't move. I'm not a praying man. Never was, not really. My father was, and I watched it do him no particular good, so I gave it up before I was grown. But I'll say this. Lying there in that creek, watching the light go sideways through the cottonwood leaves above me, I wanted something to pray to, something to make an accounting to. 51 years, and what did they add up to? 3 cattle drives I hadn't owned a share of, 1 dead brother, 1 woman who'd married someone with better prospects, and $11 in coin in my saddlebag. I lay there doing the arithmetic of my life and finding it wanting. The fever came on with the dark. After that it was just heat and noise. Frogs, the creek running over stones, something big moving in the brush once, maybe a deer, maybe a bear. I couldn't lift my head to check. My leg was a thing separate from me, something heavy and wrong attached to my body that I couldn't make sense of. At some point I started talking, though I don't know to who. My brother's name a few times. The name of that woman once. Things a man says when he thinks there's nobody listening. She came sometime before dawn. I know it was before dawn because there were still stars. I can see that in my memory, that strip of sky above the creek and the stars still out, just beginning to pale at one edge. And I heard her before I saw her, which was the first strange thing because she was moving quiet. Not trail noise, not crashing through brush. Quiet, careful movement, the kind you learn when someone is hunting you. She stopped at the edge of the creek maybe 10 yards from me and didn't come any closer for a long time. I couldn't see her face well in that dark, but I could see she was young and she was alone and she was carrying something wrapped in cloth. I must have looked dead or close to it because she just stood there watching me, assessing. Not scared exactly, it wasn't that kind of stillness. It was the stillness of someone who's been afraid for a long time and has learned to think before they move. I said something, I don't know what. She didn't run. She came forward and crouched and put her hand on my forehead, then on my neck below the jaw. Checking my temperature, checking my pulse, businesslike and sure. Then she pulled back the torn trouser leg and looked at the bite in the pale light, and she made a sound, not alarmed, more like confirmed, like she'd been expecting something bad and was relieved it wasn't worse. She said, "You cut it." I said I had. She said that helped some, didn't help enough. She stood back up and looked at me. "Can you move to flat ground? I won't drag you." I said I could try. It took a while. She didn't touch me, just walked alongside and talked me through it. Move your left hand. Not yet, wait. Now, like she'd done something like this before. By the time I was flat on my back in the grass above the creek bank, the sky was going gray and I could see her clearly. She was younger than I'd thought, maybe 20, maybe a little more, though there was something in her face that made guessing hard. She wore a man's coat too big for her, trousers worn through boots. Her hair was pulled close under a piece of cloth tied at the back of her neck. She had a look to her that I recognized only later after I'd had time to think on it, the look of someone who carries a weight that never sets down, not broken, not beaten, just accustomed to wait. She built a small fire, shielded low so it threw light but no real smoke. She was very deliberate about the smoke. From the bundle, she unwrapped dried root, two kinds of leaf I didn't recognize, a clay pot no bigger than both my fists. She worked at the edge of the fire and didn't speak. I watched her. I wasn't able to do much else. She boiled the root down to something thick and dark and bitter-smelling, and she got me to drink it, which was not easy. Then she took the second leaf, chewed it herself until it was paste, and packed it against the bite. The cold of it against the swollen skin was sharp enough that I sucked air through my teeth. She didn't apologize for that, just pressed it firm and wrapped it with a strip torn from something at the bottom of her bundle. She said, "You'll sleep now, that's the root." I said, "Who are you?" She looked at me straight on. Her eyes were dark and even and gave nothing away. She said, "Nobody you know." I said, "Where'd you learn that, what you just did?" She was quiet a moment, not a dodging quiet, a thinking quiet. Then she said, "There was an old woman, she knew plants." She folded the remaining cloth and tucked it back in her bundle. I watched her. She let me watch. That was a long time ago. The root did what she said it would. I was out within the minute. I'll tell you something about those next 2 days, because they matter. When I woke the first time, it was afternoon, blazing hot, and she had rigged a piece of canvas from the cottonwood branches above me so I was in shade. I don't know where she'd gotten the canvas. She was sitting with her back to a tree maybe 20 feet away, watching the open ground to the south. Not watching me, watching the distance. I watched her for a while before I said anything. The way she sat upright, still, eyes moving in slow sweeps, it wasn't rest. She was working, on guard. For me, and I understood somehow also in spite of me, like her keeping watch was its own thing, a habit or a principle, not something she'd decided for my particular sake. I said, "You don't have to stay." She looked over at me, something in her face that might have been surprise or might have been a different thing. She said, "I know." That was all. She went back to watching the south. The second day I was clearer-headed, and the leg, though still swollen and tender, was beginning to show the improvement that means a man is going to live. She brought me water in the clay pot, and I drank, and she checked the poultice and replaced the leaf paste. I asked her name. She thought about it for a moment, the way a person does when a question touches something complicated, and she said, "Marin." I told her mine. Callum Dowd, out of Missouri by way of everywhere else. She almost smiled at that. Not quite, but almost. I said, "You're running." She kept her eyes on the poultice. She said, "Aren't you?" I thought about the $11 and the dead brother and the no-share drives. I said, "Not from anything in particular." She said, "That's a different kind of running." She tied off the bandage. "The kind I do, there's particular men behind it." I didn't ask more then. I was learning already that Marin gave you what she meant to give you and held the rest, and pushing only made the held things harder to come by. So I let it lie. But I lay there in the shade she'd built me, and I thought about those particular men, and the direction she'd come from, south and east, given where she'd been watching, and about what that meant in Texas in 1863. The war was still grinding somewhere far away and changing nothing out here yet, or changing everything in ways nobody had settled on. And here was a young woman alone in open country who knew plants, and how to sit a watch, and how to build a shielded fire, and who had stopped for a dying stranger when stopping was the most dangerous thing she could have done. I thought about that, about what it cost her stopping. On the third morning, I could put weight on the leg. I got myself upright against the cottonwood, and she stood back and watched me and said nothing until I'd done it. And then she said, "Another day before you ride." I said, "Where are you headed?" She looked away across the creek. "North," she said, and then north again. I said, "Kansas." She didn't answer, didn't have to. I said, "I know a route." I wasn't sure why I said it. It came out before I'd thought it through. "Stays clear of the main settlements. There's a family in the Flint Hills, used to be anyway, that helped men in your situation. They had a farm with a red barn, and they flew a particular flag when it was safe to come to the door. I did some work for them one season 8-9 years back. They may still be there." Marin looked at me. I said, "I'm going north anyway. I've got nothing to go back to south of here." She said, "Why would you do that?" And I had to think about it, not about whether I meant it, but about how to say it plain. I said, "Because you stayed." I looked at the leg, at the clean wrapping she'd done. "When staying was the thing that could get you caught, you stayed anyway." I looked up at her. "Nobody's done that for me before." "Not for a long time." Something shifted in her face. She looked at me for a long moment, really looked. the kind of looking that goes past the surface and takes measure of what's underneath. And I'd been looked at plenty of ways in my life, dismissed, overlooked, tolerated, but I hadn't been looked at that way in so long that it took me a moment to recognize it for what it was. She was deciding something. She said, "I travel at night." I said, "I know how to travel at night." She said, "You'll keep up." I said I would. She nodded once short. The conversation was over. Here's the thing about traveling with someone who has reason to be careful. You learn to be careful, too. Marin moved through country like water, always along natural cover, always with an ear to the wind, always with a read on where she was in relation to the high ground. I'd spent 30 years in open country and thought myself decent enough at it, but watching her taught me things. She'd stop and I'd listen and hear nothing, and then 15 minutes later I'd hear hoofbeats far to the east. She always knew before I did. I asked her once how she did that. She said, "You learn what silence should sound like, then you learn when it doesn't." I thought about that for a long time. It seemed true of more things than just hoofbeats. We didn't talk much at first, through those first nights. She wasn't unfriendly, only careful. And careful was the right word. She was careful with everything, with fire and noise and her own trust, in the way that someone is careful who has learned through losing. I didn't push, and she didn't give more than she was ready to give, and that suited me. I've never been a man who needed a lot of talking to feel easy. But things do come out in the long miles. She'd grown up on a tobacco plantation in Virginia. The old woman who'd taught her plants, an elder named Celestine, who'd been brought over long ago and knew more about green things than anyone Marin had ever met before or since, she was gone. Most of the people Marin had known were gone or scattered. She'd run in the spring when a group was moved, when she saw the direction of things and understood that waiting was its own death sentence. She'd been running since April. This was July. 3 months. I thought about her walking and hiding and rationing and moving through hostile country alone for 3 months. I'd spent 3 months stretches on drives with 20 men around me, and they'd been hard enough. I said, "You must be tired." She considered the word. She said, "Tired's the wrong word. It's more like," she paused. "You know how a river runs different depending on the season? High and fast and cold in spring, lower and slower when it's been dry. I'm running lower and slower." "But I'm still running." I said, "The Flint Hills family, if they're still there. There's a root cellar under the red barn where people have stayed for weeks at a time. It's clean and it's safe." She looked at me sideways. I said, "I'm not saying you need it. I'm saying it's there." A long pause. Then she said, "I've never stayed anywhere safe for weeks at a time." I didn't say anything to that. Sometimes you don't need to. Dobie took to her, which meant something. He was not an easy horse with strangers. The first night she'd approached him slow and let him smell her hand and spoken to him in a low voice that I couldn't quite hear from where I lay, and after a while he'd bumped his head against her shoulder, which was as close as Dobie ever got to affection. I watched that happen and felt something I couldn't quite name. I was carrying her on Dobie those first 2 nights, because walking on the bad leg was something I could do for short stretches and no more. I'd offered to walk and she'd said no, that was foolishness, and she'd gone up behind me on the saddle with less ceremony than most people get into a chair. She put her hands at my sides to hold, not gripping, just resting. Her forehead once dropped briefly against my back when we went through a long, dark stretch of cedar, and I think she'd nearly slept. I kept the horse steady. That was the whole of my contribution those nights, keeping the horse steady while she nearly slept. It felt like something. After a long time alone, even that small thing felt like something worth being. We'd been traveling 8 nights when we came up to the place on the Neosho River where I used to know the crossings. It was running higher than I remembered. Not impassable, but tricky, and Dobie had a habit of moving sideways in fast water, which was fine when a man was alone on him, but was a different proposition with 2 aboard. I found the old crossing by the willow stand and sat looking at it in the gray before dawn. Marin sat behind me and looked at it too. She said, "How bad is it?" I said, "Not bad, just needs doing right. There's a line of rock about 15 feet in that you can't see, but he knows it's there and he'll want to angle toward it. I need to hold him straight until we're past it." She said, "Then hold him straight." I said I would. It went fine. The water was cold and came up to my boot tops, and Dobie moved sideways twice, and I held him and corrected, and he straightened, and we came up the north bank with nothing worse than wet feet, and Dobie shaking himself hard enough to near unseat us both. Marin held on and didn't make a sound. On the bank, she slid down and stood and wrung the water from her coat hem and looked at me. She said, "You're good with him." I said, "He's a good horse." She said, "That too, but you're good with him." She looked at me a moment longer in that measuring way of hers. "You're good at a lot of things and you don't say much about it." I didn't know what to say to that. She said, "Where I came from, the men who didn't advertise themselves were usually the ones worth something." She turned and looked north. "I've known a lot of men since April, most of them not worth their noise." I got down off Dobie and stood beside her, and we both looked north at the gray Kansas sky. I said, "I'm just a man trying to get somewhere." She said, "I know, that's what I mean." The red barn was there. We came up on it 2 nights later from the east, staying in the tree line until I could read the sign on the barn eave, a particular cut of wood with a particular direction to it, and the sign said it was clear. The family's name was Beauchamp. Hester Beauchamp came to the back door of the house with a lantern when I knocked, and she looked at me, and then passed me at Marin, and she opened the door wide without asking a single question. That's a thing you don't forget, a door opening like that, the deliberateness of it. Marin stood in Hester Beauchamp's kitchen and ate cornbread and beans, and Hester poured her coffee and they talked in low voices while I sat with my back to the stove and felt the heat work into the leg, and let myself unwind for the first time in 9 days. Hester's husband, a quiet man named Orrin, came in and shook my hand and said there'd been some men through 2 weeks back, riders asking questions, but they'd gone south again. Marin looked at me when Orrin said that. I looked back at her. We stayed 4 days. I did what work I could around the place, mended a section of fence, reshod one of their horses, cleaned the well rope, and Marin helped Hester in the kitchen and the garden and replenished some of the medicines the Beauchamps kept in the root cellar, which she seemed to know needed replenishing without being asked. I watched her move through those 4 days with something loosening in her, not the cautiousness dissolving that didn't dissolve, but something underneath it that had been braced hard beginning to hold a little lighter. On the 3rd evening, we sat outside on the bench behind the house in the last of the light, and she said, "I don't know what's up ahead." I said, "Nobody does." She said, "I mean, I don't know what a person does on the other side of all this. I've been running so long, I don't know what not running looks like." I thought about it. I said, "I think it probably looks like sitting on a bench in the evening." She looked at me, then she looked back out at the light on the fields. She said, "I think I'd like that." I said, "I think you earned it." She was quiet a while. Then she said, "You could stay north too, you know. You said you had nothing south of here." I said, "I know." She said, "I'm not saying." She stopped, started again. "I'm just saying that a man who knows the country and knows the crossings and can work with animals and doesn't make a lot of noise about himself is not a man who has nothing." I felt something shift in my chest, something that had been hard for a long time. I said, "I hadn't thought about it that way." She said, "I know, that's why I said it." She reached over then without looking at me and put her hand over mine where it rested on my knee, not gripping, just resting, the way she'd held on to my sides crossing the Neosho, light and sure. I turned my hand over and held hers. We sat like that while the light went out of the sky and the first stars came. That was 1863. I'll tell you where we are now, a place called Emmett Creek, just north of the Kaw River, on 40 acres we bought from an old German farmer who wanted to go back east to his grandchildren. Marin knows every plant on those 40 acres by 2 names, the name and the name Celestine gave it. There's a kitchen garden and a barn and 2 horses, one of which is Dobie, 16 years old now and slower but still sound. And in the summer the grass comes up to the sill of the south window, and in the evening the light on it looks like something you'd have to pay to see somewhere. Some men in the county treat us strangely. Not most, but some. Marin has never mentioned it to me, and I've never mentioned it to her, because it belongs to the category of things that are small against the large fact of having gotten here. She is still the most careful person I know, still reads silence better than I'll ever learn to, still knows when something is wrong before it announces itself. On Sundays sometimes she teaches children in the back room of the church in Emmett Creek. Reading, numbers, names of plants, names of birds. She's good at it. The children are easy with her in the way children are easy with someone who sees them plain. I never did find another job with another outfit. Turned out 40 acres and a carpenter's wage for odd work, and a woman who believed in what I was enough to run on. More than enough. More than I'd tallied in that creek with my face in the mud, doing the arithmetic of what I'd come to. She came in this morning while I was pulling my boot on, and she stood in the doorway with the coffee and the morning light behind her. And she looked at me the way she looks at me, that look that takes full measure and finds something there. And she said, "The Keller fence needs fixing before the Chandlers come through." I said I'd see to it. She handed me the coffee and went back to the kitchen. I sat on the edge of the bed with the coffee, and the morning coming in through the window, and the sound of her moving around in the kitchen, and I thought about a strip of sky over a creek and stars going pale at one edge. About a woman who stopped when stopping was the most dangerous thing she could do. 40 acres, 2 horses. One woman who saw me whole at the bottom of the worst night of my life and thought, yes, this one is worth the trouble. I drank my coffee. Then I pulled on the other boot and went to fix the Keller fence.